Hello, 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 and good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to JTDA's BizTech Lunch and Learn series. This is epic episode number 3, and we're going to be talking about a very hot topic, especially if you are in Jamaica, and that is the Data Protection Act. And we are going to be sharing some basic principles and possibly tools that you can utilize as a business owner or as an executive that's in a business that's actually going to be facing this change that's coming up very shortly. Joining me for our Lunch and Learn today is Shavaniese Arnold, who's an attorney at law and the manager of governance, risk, and compliance with PLMC Jamaica. Welcome, Shav.
Thanks for having me. I'm so happy to be here, actually.
Excellent. Shav is also going to be a speaker at our upcoming BizTech conference, Tech Fusion, which is going to be November 14th and 15th. So make sure that you mark your calendars if you have not already done so. So let's dive right in. I hope everybody has their lunch. I have my drink because I can't eat while I'm talking. That's the only reason. But I hope you guys have your lunch because we're going to make this an interesting conversation, right? Make sure that it's informative and also interesting. Let's start off by just getting, maybe the latest update on the Data Protection Act as it relates to Jamaica.
Well, my generation would say the latest update is very juicy. There was a press briefing just yesterday, and the Information Commissioner, she indicated that the plan is to start the registration process for data controllers on December 1. She does not want data controllers to be fearful of the December date because what they're thinking about is constructive collaboration with a view to building confidence. And she doesn't want them to be frightened, to be apprehensive about what December 1 might bring. She wants us to recognize that Jamaica is a young and new jurisdiction, and it will take time for us to grow, develop, and build out. So based on the indication, the intention is really to give controllers some time for compliance. And what they're saying is that they're planning to do this by using a phase approach. So we can record for that. Yes.
Okay, well, that is actually a juicy update. And if you didn't hear it when it was originally announced by the commissioner, you would have heard it here first on our Lunch and Learn at JTDA. Now, thank you so much for sharing that. And you actually brought out a really important point, which is something that is actually pretty common when it comes to significant change, right? And that is about the fear factor. And I'm hoping that through answering some of the questions that I have for you today, that we'll be able to dispel some of the fears, in particular around the timing and the regulatory requirements, and then the challenges or the consequences that you may face should you not be in compliance, right? So it's good to hear that they're taking a phased approach. I think possibly they would have heard the word on the street, which is, we're afraid, right? So that's good to hear. Can you explain the key principles of data protection that organizations need to understand to achieve this compliance?
Okay, so when we hear data protection, we hear privacy, we're thinking, oh, this is so much, we can't bother with this, we're going to have to spend so much money. But it is good for us to know exactly what we're dealing with and what we're talking about and what you are required to do. Now, under the Act, there are some standards. At PLMC, we call them the data privacy principles, right? And these are the things that we must keep at the forefront of our minds whenever we are processing personal data. There are 8 of them. The first one is lawfulness and fairness. It is as simple as it sounds. Process the personal data in accordance with the law. You must have a lawful purpose for doing so. And as it relates to fairness, you must ensure that you do not deceive data subjects or mislead them as it relates to what you are going to be doing with their personal data. When I talk about lawful purpose or legal bases, What I mean is that you must determine whether the reason you're processing the personal data is the basis on which you're processing the personal data is consent. So you've gotten the consent of the data subject, or you're doing it because of a contract that you have with the data subject. Think about your employees. You're doing it because of a legal obligation imposed on you by a legislation, let's say. Think about the information you have to share. Think about the TAJ, or information you might have to share with the FID or any other regulatory authority in Jamaica. So your basis there would be regulatory compliance. There is also a legal basis such as public task. This is what government authorities can use to say, okay, this is the basis on which I am processing your personal data. This particular act has given me these functions. And in order to execute these functions, I need your personal data and I need to process your personal data. So those are some of the bases on which data controllers can process personal data. Fairness now, this is extremely important. And I find that controllers tend to be a little bit guarded when data subjects come to them and ask them, okay, but why do you need that? I have a right to know. I
Right.
to tell me that is it, Stacey. And
Absolutely.
that is what we need to understand. And I want to implore data subjects, you see, when you see the privacy policies and you see the privacy notices, read them. This is what it relates to. They are telling you what they are doing with your personal data. And many times we, as data subjects, try to raise problems and say, oh, but you didn't tell me. Oh, but you were directed to the privacy notice, you were directed to the privacy policy, and that outlines what they're doing with your personal data. So that is it as it relates to lawfulness and fairness. Another important one, you see, Stacey, is purpose limitation. Stop thinking that you can collect data subjects information and do whatever you want to do with it. Discuss it with your friends, discuss it with your mother, discuss it with your uncles and aunts, and so on over some drinks. No, it's time to stop that. You have to limit the processing of the personal data to the purpose for which you collected it in the first place. Right? So if you say you're going to process my credit application, I shouldn't be getting any messages about promotions that you're having. Worse, if my credit application is denied. No, 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 no. So we have to think about those things, right? Data minimization. No. Stop collecting more personal data than you need for a particular purpose.
That's a good
Any
one.
That's it. So what you collect, it must be adequate and, very importantly, relevant and limited to the purpose. So in Jamaica, we're used to these long, cumbersome forms asking you for place of birth, name of spouse, and all these fancy things. So we're gonna have to change the way that we do things. So it's not that you can't ask for personal data. We're looking at how you do your collection. Do not collect more than you need. There's also storage limitation. Don't keep the data for longer than the purpose for which you have collected it, longer than is necessary for the purpose for which you collected it. People will have your information in files for years upon years upon years. They just might forget about it. There are people accessing those files. You don't know who has access to those things, right? And that is really what the Data Protection Act is here to do, protect us as data subjects as it relates to our personal data and the exposure that is there. There's also a transfer of data. I know that, in the data protection space, Jamaica is doing this, and the Information Commissioner did say this yesterday, because we want to show that we fit in and we know what the principles are, we know what the standards are. And these are things that will welcome investors into our country when they know that, yes, man, they have the necessary protections. So, Stacey, think about data controllers transferring personal data to whichever territory, not knowing if they have a Data Protection Act,
Right.
not having any contracts with processors. So there's really
Mhm.
no protection for the personal data that you're sharing. So personal data shall not be transferred outside of Jamaica to a state or territory unless there are adequate measures in place in that territory. There are, of course, exceptions. And then we must ensure that we respect the rights of data subjects. That is
Mm.
just one standard. And it
Yeah.
goes to show how important the rights of the data subject are. There's also accuracy. Let us work to ensure that what we collect, what we process is accurate and kept up to date. And many persons ask, okay, but what if the data subject give me incorrect information? Of course, I mean, the act does not penalize you for that. You will not be penalized for that. But the point at which you become aware that this data is inaccurate, you must rectify it without delay. And then there's this very important one, security. The IT professionals care about this. And a lot of people think that this is all data protection is about. But you realize I went through all those things before, and I am just now getting to security, which is one standard that requires data controllers to have appropriate technical and organizational measures in place. When we're talking about it, we call it the CIA of data protection, right? Maintaining the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of data. So when we talk about this, we're talking about locking the file in cabinets, having a firewall, your encryption, your passwords, and so on. So that's really it in a nutshell.
Wow, that's a very big nutshell there that you just went through. Just saying. And I think part of what I appreciate is that while the term itself may be a bit technical, you were able to break it down so that it sounded, logical to the persons that have to be managing and supporting data and the data subjects. Now, I think part of what I also picked up from the 8 principles that you shared was that in many ways, our data controllers or even companies, I would say, when they think about data privacy, the first thing that comes to their minds is really about the customers. They think about data of persons who are not inside the organization. So I was happy to hear you actually mention the when you were talking about lawfulness and fairness, that this is also relevant to your employees, especially for small businesses. That's very critical for them to understand that it's not just about customer information, but it's also about persons that are contractually obligated to the organization as well.
Yes, but I think just as you said that, I should drop it here for the people who might not know. We're talking about personal data and sensitive personal data. So this is data that makes an individual identifiable. So my name, I think my name might be somewhere on screen. That is what you can use to identify me. Stacey's name might be somewhere on screen too. That you can use to identify her. This very stream you can use to identify us, or physical features, that sensitive personal data. Think about all the information that is on your driver's license or in your passport, right? So your TRN, your height, your date of birth, all of that can be used to identify you. So that is really what we're talking about. We're not talking about your commercial information, right? Your proprietary information, no. Trade secrets, none of that. We're talking about data that relates to natural living individuals. So that's me and that's you and that's Stacey. So that's what we're talking about.
Okay, I think that clarification was also very helpful. So it's that personal identification information that each person has, and will more than likely, especially when they're doing business with an organization, will more than likely in one way, shape, or form exchange or give. I also wanted you to maybe touch on some more the transfer component as I asked my next question. Earlier, you talked about our ability to transfer data. And I think in many instances, especially when you're thinking about your marketing departments and when you're having webinars or events, and you have customers that register, and maybe you have sponsors who you promise information of your attendees, and it's something that's actually very common that we may not even think about as being subject to data privacy laws, but that falls under transfer.
Yes.
And one of the things that you raised was about making sure that when you're looking to transfer data, you really also need to see whether or not the location or the region that you're transferring to, that they actually have acts or laws or policies in place. So my follow-up question there is, how does the Data Protection Act relate to the General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR? And what are the implications for compliance, if any?
Okay, so we took our act from the big guns, and the big guns, that's the GDPR. However, even though it is similar in many ways, so all the standards I outlined to you, you can find them under the GDPR as well. However, there's still some differences. So under the GDPR, obligations are imposed on data controllers and data processors. Now, the data controller is the one who determines the purposes for which and the manner in which personal data is processed. So you're in charge of it, and you determine the how and the why and what you're going to be doing with the personal data. So you're the controller. However, controllers, different businesses have data processors, people who they share information with in order to carry out some processes on their behalf. And a very common one is processing payroll, right? So companies have vendors who they share information with to process that payroll, and that is personal data going over to them. Now, what we need to understand is that under the GDPR, the obligations under the Act are on both the employer and the processor who they have processing the payroll, right? But
Yes.
here in Jamaica, the obligations are imposed on the employer. And it is the employer now, the business now, which must ensure that mechanisms are put in place to protect the personal data that they share with that vendor who's processing payroll. Now, they do this by ensuring, of course, you have different clauses in contract to bind the data processor to the obligations under the Act. And one important clause that ought to be in the contracts is to direct these data processors to act only on the data controller's instructions as it relates to the processing of the personal data. So that is one very significant difference. Another one too, Stacey, is that under the GDPR, there is the right to erasure, right? So you can write to a controller asking them to erase your information. However,
Just checking to see if I see the time still going on my side. I seem to have lost my expert. So I'm going to just ask for my support team to just check in and see what is happening with my expert. So to recap where we were just now, we're talking about the relationship between Jamaica's Data Protection Act and the GDPR. And essentially what Shavaniese was sharing is that our laws, our actual act, was actually modeled from the GDPR, but there are some areas where there are slight distinctions or differences. And in those areas, of course, we would want to make sure that persons are aware of where those differences are and whether or not there are any implications. And she was actually just about to get into the second area where we have potential implications. And I think she is back. So I was just sharing that we were talking about the distinctions between our act and the GDPR, and that we may have some areas where there are slight differences, and you were about to talk about the second one.
Oh, so the second one is as it relates to the rights of data subjects. In Jamaica, we do not have the right to erasure, but they have that under the GDPR. So in under the GDPR, you can write to a controller and say, oh, please delete my information that you have for me. I mean, I don't know why we didn't take this under our Data Protection
It's
Act.
a very interesting one. Yes.
That can be posed to the Information Commissioner, maybe. But those are some of the differences.
Okay. Thank you for that. And I already kind of started the recap when we lost you for a second there. So I'll actually just move on to the next question, which I think is very significant, and it is part of where some of the fear factor stems from for persons who are in organizations that maybe not are not yet ready from a compliance perspective, or even if they're able to register, they don't have all the pieces in place or have a clear understanding of the implications. What are the consequences of non-compliance with the data protection regulation, both legally and also in terms of reputation? And guys, I want you to make sure you're listening, because this is what I know you really care about. If there were no consequences come December 1, okay.
Yes.
So over to you,
Right.
Shav.
All right. So, I mean, a precursor to this, you see, I always say to people, consider this question: what do you prefer? The price of compliance or the price of non-compliance, right? So as it relates to non-compliance now, there are fines of up to 4% of your annual gross worldwide turnover. That can be a whole heap of money for some organizations. There are fines up to $5 million, fines of $7 million as well. There is also imprisonment, the possibility of being imprisoned, yes, and I do believe it's up to 12 years. So the periods range depending on what the contravention is. But separate and apart from the fines and the imprisonment, you see, there are some other things that we have to consider. You have to consider the reputational damage, right? From, let's say, an incident or a breach. You have to consider losing customers who no longer have any confidence in you. They keep seeing your company in the news. Oh, there's a breach down there today. And customers are wondering again, no man, I need to change. I need to change bank. I need to change it.
I was about to say, especially when it's a bank, you're like, let me move my money. Okay, and we've lost Shavaniese again. But that's actually a really great point. I think there's a lot of concern around the probably financial implications, or financial consequences of non-compliance, or the possibility of incarceration, being locked up because you are out of compliance, depending on what exactly the challenge is. But more importantly, I think something that is probably more visible, and in many cases something that we've all experienced in one way, shape, or the other, is the reputational damage that could ensue should you find your company's name in the news for a person's data being unlawfully breached.
That is it. And I am back. I mean, technology is really failing me today. What is going on?
That's okay.
But another one you see, Stacey, it's not even just about the reputational damage and the loss of customers and the loss of revenue. Think about losing your business overall entirely. There are companies that do not rebound.
All right. So picking up from on that one, companies that do not rebound from the challenges that they may experience if they have a data breach and have to manage it. So I think one of the things that we talked about was the fines, and sometimes because the fines are so hefty, especially small businesses, if there is a breach or there is a fine for non-compliance, they could potentially go out of business, and that's actually a serious concern. So as Shavani said, are you willing to pay the cost for compliance, or the cost, would you prefer, or the cost for non-compliance? So definitely don't want to see our businesses tanking or going under because of non-compliance, right? And I think that is actually I'm really loving how you're pulling out these salient points that people may not have top of mind as things to consider.
Yes, I mean, we're all thinking about how much money we have to spend to set up a whole program, what I am required to do. But at the end of the day, you also have to think about the impact it will have on your business if you don't take these steps. So it's not even, it would be remiss of me to not carry the mandate of the Office of the Information Commissioner for us to understand that it's not just the government trying to impose endless obligations on data controllers. This is how we're going to survive in a global space. Everybody is excited about the AI. Everybody is excited. We're all on social media. But at the end of the day, think about, as a business owner, think about yourself as an individual as well, and how you would want somebody to protect your information, the
Yes.
exposure that is there because of the different technologies that we use. That's how we have to think about it. We have this right to privacy, and I do believe that this Data Protection Act will help to propel us forward. I mean, government entities and private entities, it's gonna take some time, but we have to start taking steps now. You have to make a move.
Thank you for that. And I did want to raise a quick clarification because I know that we are live or on replay on both LinkedIn and YouTube. And so earlier when we were talking about the fines, the amounts mentioned were 5 million up to 7 million. That amount is in Jamaica dollars. And so when we translate that, that's between 32,000 and 45,000 US dollars, which is still quite significant, and you can get fined multiple times. So don't think that, oh, they fine you once and it is over, right? So I just wanted to create that clarification. I did also want to raise, though, Shavaniese, the concern around affordability to get support to actually prepare or to be compliant. And we do have a very large small business ecosystem here in Jamaica. And so when you think about our MSMEs, what are some practical steps that businesses like that can take? Your patty shop that may not have a big back office, or your jewelry store owner, or somebody that has crafts that they're selling, that they have people that they have a little shop and they have people that come in with their credit cards and loyal customers, etc. How do they navigate preparation for this act?
Okay. So, yes, there are big programs that you can implement, but a very important step to take is training. Training yourself as the business owner and ensuring that your employees are trained. If they're not trained, they will not know what the standards are and what they are required to do and how they are required to act in relation to personal data. And I don't mean that you have to come to a consultant like PLMC and say, oh, please send me a proposal for training. I mean, yes, you can do that, but join the programs that you see online. This is one such very program. Log on to the free things that you have access to, because it is the same information, similar information that is being shared with you. So go out there, look on YouTube, follow the Office of the Information Commissioner on Instagram, on LinkedIn. All of us use Instagram, and that is the truth. Well, most of us follow the JTDA on Instagram as well. So just do some little research. You do not have to break the bank in order to get your employees trained, attend the seminar. Sometimes you might think you have to spend $200,000, but then you can just.
All right. So just to recap where Shavaniese was heading in terms of how to prepare. So basic, guys, it may seem, but ultimately it starts with education. So educating yourself and educating the members of your team so that you can be adequately prepared. Right. So I think that was actually a really good point, because for many persons, they immediately think, okay, I have to get ready by December 1, and automatically it's like, oh my gosh, but I can't afford no consultant, or oh my gosh, I can't afford to bring on anybody that's going to be an expert. However, there are programs, there are freemium, we call them freemium programs, where they have a free side to them, like this webinar, for example, this Lunch and Learn, quick bite-sized bits of information. And also there are some online courses that can be taken that may be cost effective, they're affordable. And then of course, the JTDA BizTech conference is coming up, and data privacy is going to be a significant focus area because of how critical it is at this point in time in Jamaica. I have just one more. Oh, go ahead.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Another thing I wanted to add, Stacey, they can get help in drafting their policies, right? So yes, you might have about 10 employees. Yes, you need the policies. You need them to know what they ought to be doing. And these policies, it's not just to draft them and have them put down. Share it with the employees so that they know that they ought to read and abide by these policies. So start with your training and ensure you draft your policies and share them throughout the organization, and speak to a consultant and let them know, listen, this is my budget, this is the number of people I have, let me know how you can help me. That is how you're going to get some assistance. That is the truth.
Absolutely. That's a great point. Also, if you actually have a budget that you can work with, which you should, all small businesses should have a budget that is dedicated to technology annually. And so this is a good opportunity to utilize that budget for a very relevant reason, right? So the final question I have for you today, Shavaniese, as we wrap this up, is whether or not there are any specific data protection considerations for businesses that handle sensitive customer information, such as financial institutions or financial data or healthcare data.
Okay, so it's not necessarily that the act says, okay, financial institutions or hospitals need to do this. However, there are stipulations as it relates to processing sensitive personal data. Now, sensitive personal data is really data relating to your genetics, your biometric data, your affiliation, so that's your ancestry, your racial or ethnic origin, political opinions, religious views as well, philosophical beliefs, your mental health condition, your physical condition too, your gender, and I think there's also alleged commission, any alleged commission of an offense. So that is sensitive personal data. The Act outlines some conditions that you ought to meet if you are going to be processing personal data. One such condition is that you ought to obtain written consent. So if you're relying on consent to process sensitive personal data, that consent ought to be in writing. And there are also the bases that I indicated earlier, like legitimate interests, vital interest, you're processing the data to save someone's life. Also, a very important one, a basis that controllers can rely on is prior publication of the information by a data subject. Data subjects like to go out and post everything on social media. Be careful
Yeah.
about what you're posting, because that is a basis on which your sensitive and personal data can be processed. So that's
Okay.
really how it's looked at as it relates to sensitive information, sensitive personal data.
Okay. All right. Now, as we wrap up, guys, I hope that you've been able to gather some key basic insights that you can start to pay attention to today, leaving this lunch and learn. Shabaniz, I just want to ask if there is anything, any final thoughts that you want to share. Thank you, Chantal. Chantal says great information. Thank you. Are there any final thoughts that you'd like to share with our viewers for them to take away with them as we head towards this December 1st date?
Yes, remember the Information Commissioner does not want us to be fearful of the December 1 date and what it might bring. They are going to be working on a phased approach. That is what they've indicated. They also indicated that the sanctions will take some time to come in. Fear is not.
All right, so it seems like I have lost Shavanice again, just slightly prematurely to our close. But the point that she was raising was really about paying attention to the fear factor. If you are feeling afraid or concerned that you're going to incur these great fines or possibly go to jail because you don't have certain Data Privacy Act related things in place, do not have that fear. Instead, get the information. Find ways to ask questions, get educated, reach out to organizations like PLMC so that they can give you even a discovery session so you can get some advice, right? But the data is out there, right? The data is out there. So we want you to make sure that you're making use of it from reliable sources like the Jamaica Technology and Digital Alliance. So thank you so much, Shavanice, for providing all this wonderful information. And I really, really look forward to seeing you speak at our upcoming conference. And to
I'm excited.
all our viewers who have joined, thank you so much for joining us. And for asking your questions or putting your comments, please make sure that you do that even after this has been shown live, because we can still respond after the fact. All right. Thanks so much, Shavaniese.
Thank you. No problem.
All
Bye.
right.